So our second thinker is Locke. Locke is a very different thinker. And to some extent, I think Locke is very useful in comparison to Hobbes to show the differences in approach. So basically, we can begin by saying that again, in terms of background, you remember for Hobbes, the background was the Protestant Reformation and the Civil War, right? So Hobbes' biggest concern is chaos. His biggest question is how can we prevent the normal functioning of civil society from breaking down and human beings returning to this horrifying state of nature where life is poor, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short, for Hobbes, right? Locke has a very different concern. So Locke is writing in support of a successful revolution, the glorious revolution of 1644, right? 1644, I hope. 1688, yeah. Sorry, yeah. 1688, yeah. 1688. And his ambition is to curtail the power of the government, basically. So he's writing. So if Hobbes is writing in support of absolute government, Locke is writing in support of limited government, limiting the power of the government. And for Hobbes, the biggest threat is chaos that erupts at the time of the Civil War. For Locke, the biggest threat is tyranny. So basically, tyranny for Locke is worse than chaos. Anyway, so, well, I mean, we can, just for fun. So you remember how it went for Hobbes. Locke is going to have to argue that the best condition of all is the civil society. And civil society is better than the state of nature, which is anarchy. But anarchy is better than the worst tyranny. This is going to be Locke's basic political formula. So he's going to have to argue that the state of nature is not perfectly good, but it's acceptable. It's good enough. It's better than the worst tyranny. This is going to be our battle objective, right, with Locke. So how does Locke begin? Locke begins, well, and also when Locke is writing, is he aware of Thomas Hobbes? Well, that's a complicated question. Is Locke actually writing against Hobbes? I don't think that he was a very careful reader, or that he understands Hobbes very well, or that he responds to Hobbes. His most important line of attack is he's writing against this person whose name is Robert Filmer. And Robert Filmer was also a defender of absolutism, but very different from Hobbes, because Robert Filmer actually defends the divine right of kings. Basically, Robert Filmer says that according to the grant from the Bible, basically, the king can do whatever. Basically, all of the subjects are king's slaves, and all of property belongs to the king by God's decree. And the kings have to trace their lineage to the eldest line of Adam, something like that. And God gives power to Adam, and Adam then bequeaths it to the kings of Europe. This is very different from Hobbes. This is also a defense of absolutism, but very different one. For Filmer, again, there's a natural hierarchy, and there's a God-given right. God designates the king. Not so for Hobbes. You see, for Hobbes, in an important respect, all forms of government for Hobbes are in some sense democracies. Even a monarchy is a democracy, because the monarch has the power by consent of the people, according to the social contract. So actually people like Filmer hate Hobbes. They agree with his conclusions that power should be absolute, but they hate his reasoning. They disagree with his reasoning. So Locke, when he writes against absolute government, he's not really attacking Hobbes. He doesn't know or understand Hobbes very well. He's writing against this person, Robert Filmer, who writes, in support of the divine right of kings. Divine right of kings. So where does Locke begin? Again, Locke begins from a very, very, very different place. He begins also with God. So if point number 0 for Hobbes was that the world is matter in motion, Here, we are not talking about matter and motion. We are talking about God. Now, remember, we are writing after the Wars of Religion. We are writing after the scientific revolution. And John Locke is also an empiricist. So when he appeals to God, how can he appeal to God? How do we know about God? Do we know about God from the Bible? And Locke basically says, not exactly. Because reason, human reason, is above the Bible for Locke. It is human reason which should judge which book is an actual revelation from God. Because, if you think about this for 5 seconds, you have the Upanishads, the Vedas, you have the Bhagavad Gita, you have the Quran, you have the Bible, you have the Torah, you have all sorts of texts. You have the Book of Mormon, right? I don't know, you have Lovecraftian mythos or something like that. How do you decide which is the sacred book? And Locke says, well, reason should tell you. So reason judges what book counts as revelation. Locke says, yes, of course, God's revelation is supreme, but we should use our reason to determine what are actual words of God and not just something else. So Locke has to establish the existence of God on the basis of pure reason outside of any revelation. And this is what he does so. He uses the famous design argument, the teleological design argument. So if Hobbes was an anti-teleologist, anti-teleological thinker, Locke is a teleological thinker. He uses a design argument, which has been known in the Middle Ages as the teleological argument. Teleological. Maybe I should spend 5 seconds to talk about this again. So the Greek word is telos, and it means aim or purpose or goal. And basically, the teleological argument goes back to Thomas Aquinas. And by the way, Locke has a lot in common with political philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. To a very large extent, political philosophy of Locke is imported from Thomas Aquinas, with some interesting differences. But still, basically, what Aquinas says is, when you look outside the window, the world seems orderly. The sun rises every morning, the seasons change in order, the human body is this wonderful machine. All of this seems to be designed. All of these seems far too orderly to have arisen purely by chance. This is before Darwin, by the way, right? So this seems to be a pretty powerful argument. So Locke would say that because the world seems designed, we have to assume that there is a designer. So outside of Christianity or Judaism or Islam, whatever, Locke thinks that every person alive on planet Earth, including the Indians of the Americas, and I suppose the Indians of India, everybody should agree that there is a God. By pure reason. So reason establishes the existence of God for every person on planet Earth. And this is not a God of a particular religion. This is simply like the God of the philosophers, the God of pure reason. Sometimes this view is called Deism. Deism has different connotations. I'm using it here to signify, we're not talking about Christianity, we're talking about some kind of universal religion of reason. That every human being, again, including the Indians, who have never heard of Jesus or Christianity, can still, by the light of their own reason, agree that there's a God. And not only that, but agree that God makes everything. God makes everything. And because God makes everything, He owns everything. And it means that everything that you see around you is God's property. And because it is God's property, you can naturally derive the law of nature. And it's important, you see? Remember, for Hobbes, rights exist before duties. In fact, in the state of nature, everybody has a right to everything, which is the same thing to say as nobody has a right to nothing. Not so for Locke. Not so for Locke. It says, because everything is God's property, we can naturally, by the light of our reason, see the law of nature. And the law of nature tells you a very simple thing. The law of nature tells you a very simple thing. Don't touch God's stuff. God has made it. It's not for you to destroy it without a good reason. So basically, the law of nature, in some general fashion, says no one should destroy anything, because everything belongs to God, unless there's a good reason to do so. So for example, I can eat an apple to sustain my body. So in the process of eating an apple, I am destroying an apple. But I am doing so with a good reason, with a high purpose. In fact, the technical formulation of the law of nature is this. no one ought to harm another in his life, liberty, health, or possessions. This is the formulation of the law of nature. No one ought to harm another in his life, liberty, health, or possessions. Life, liberty, health, or possessions. And, Locke means this very seriously. In fact, if you can prevent damage to somebody else, you should. It is our duty to be the keepers of God's property. Let's suppose if somebody is starving to death, and I have more than I need, I have the duty to give it to them. And this is going to be important. For Locke, we don't really have private property, because all property belongs to God. We have conditional, limited right of private property. But this right of private property is always subject to the constraint. So again, always subject to the constraint that if somebody needs what I have more than I do, and I have enough to survive, I have to share. I must share. So in this, and by the way, so it means that other people who need it more than I do, and if I have more than I need, they can come in and take it from me, and I have no right to resist that. We'll get there. We'll talk about all this in a second. But this is the basic idea that everything belongs to God, and we are sent to this world. We are not masters of ourselves. We do not belong to ourselves. In fact, we belong to God, and we have a duty to preserve ourselves. I cannot kill myself. I do not have the right to kill myself because I belong to God. I have a duty to preserve myself. And in fulfilling this duty, to preserve myself and also to preserve others. It's important. So, my first duty is to preserve myself, and then, unless I'm threatening my own self-preservation, I also have to preserve others. I also have to help others. Help others, right? And immediately you can ask this question, an important question. Is it okay to kill a cow to save a human being? And Locke says yes. Is it okay to kill a human being to save a cow? See, we're all God's creatures. Cows are God's creatures. I am a God's creature. Why is it fine to kill a cow to save a man and not the other way around? Well, what Locke is going to say is that human beings have reason. And human beings have this unique status among all the things in the world. Only human beings know that there's a God and can know what is God's law and can choose to obey or disobey God. That's why sort of our relationship to God is unique. We have this unique moral relationship. That is why there are inferior and superior rank of creatures. Human beings are superior and animals are inferior because they do not have reason, they do not know that there's a God, and they cannot choose to obey God's law because they do not know God's law. They just act instinctually. So it's okay to kill a cow to save a human being, but it's not okay to kill a cow just for fun. You should not do this because cow is God's property. So unless you're doing this with a good reason, you should not destroy God's property. You cannot just go, let's say, around the forest and just knock down apples just for fun. You cannot do that because everything is God's property. Again, it's a very different world from Hobbes. I hope you can see immediately. So where does political power come in? Political power comes in already immediately in the state of nature. So in the state of nature, life is not so bad because every human being, every person knows the law of nature approximately. Every person knows the law of nature. We all know the law of nature, and everybody in the when you talk about laws have to be enforced to be really laws. You see, the laws of nature for Hobbes are not enforced by anybody. That's why Hobbes says, strictly speaking, they're not laws, they're theorems. Because in order for them to really be laws, you need to have power to enforce them. So who has the power to enforce the laws of nature for Locke? And Locke says everybody. So in the state of nature, every single person has a duty. You see, rights without duties don't make sense. Your right to life, liberty, health, and possessions is guaranteed by everybody else. Everybody else has a duty to preserve your life, liberty, health, and possessions. So by the way, this means right now, if you can, let's say, let's take me as an example. I have these wonderful things, which have approximately 0 calories, right? So I buy this for fun. I don't need them. While there are children in Africa who are starving. So according to Locke, I am a criminal against God. I have an absolute unconditional duty to God to take things I don't need. For example, the money I used to buy this wonderful thing, right? And I should send it to children in Africa. This is my unconditional duty to God, according to Locke. So you see, some people say, Locke is this proponent of capitalism. Well, not exactly. I mean, is this capitalism? Does it sound like, libertarian capitalism to you? Not exactly, not exactly. So, and again, this is very important. For this inequality to hold true, again, it is not civil society, political society, right? Political society. Okay, let me write political society. We'll double check this. I think it's political society. So political society is better than the state of nature, but the state of nature is better than the worst tyranny. For this inequality to hold true, it must be that the critical mass of people know that there's a law of nature by the light of their own reason. So Locke he's making a very strong claim, which, by the way, I'm not sure if it's true. But his strong claim is you can go anywhere in the world, and in the jungles of the Amazon, you see a random stranger, and you can count on them knowing that there's a God, and knowing that there's a law of nature, and protecting you. And by the way, if it's empirically not true, then all of Locke's philosophy goes out the window. Well, there are alternative interpretations of Locke's philosophy, but we'll talk about them in due course. So everybody knows the law of nature, and everybody knows the law of nature, and everybody has specifically what he says, the executive power of the law of nature. Every person has the executive power of the law of nature. We have an executive power, a duty. It's important. Duties for Locke are more important than rights. You have a duty to fulfill the law of nature. And this is also going to be the basis of political power in society, but we'll get there in a second. Now, how does this work in the state of nature? Well, in the state of nature, the most important expression of this duty to fulfill the law of nature is punishment. Again, punishment is crucially important. You have a right, but also, not just a right, a duty to punish the offenders against the law of nature. So if you see a person in the state of nature, you're just roaming through the woods, and by the way, this is important. So Hobbes does not think that the state of nature is the historical condition. I mean, the state of nature is real for both Hobbes and Locke, but for Hobbes it exists. Sorry, for Locke, for Hobbes it's not what exists sometime in the ancient past. For Locke it is. Locke actually believes that in the ancient past, in the times of the children of Adam, this is how everybody lived. So for Locke, it is an actual historical condition. And basically, if you're roaming through the forest and you see somebody breaking God's law, breaking the law of nature, it is your duty to punish the offender as much as you can. Now, if let's say if the offender is a huge and strong beast and you will just kill yourself in the process, don't do that. But to the extent that you can reasonably expect to succeed, it is your duty to punish the offenders in the state of nature. Now, more specifically, he says, so it's not a right, but a duty to punish. And by the way, without this would not work. This would not work. The state of nature is relatively harmonious only because you can count on other people protecting you. You can count on other people knowing and recognizing that they have a duty to protect you, right? Now, more specifically, so when you punish, you may punish for reparation and restraint. Reparation and restraint. So maybe I should write this on the board. Reparation and restraint. So again, we are in the state of nature, somewhere in the ancient times in the jungle, and a strong and mean bully comes in and steals your neighbor's stuff. It is your duty to punish the bully, first of all, to return the stuff back, reparation. Or let's say if somebody injures you, he has to pay compensation. So reparation, compensation, basically compensation. But also restraint, not just that, because even if, or in addition to paying back the debt, you also have to, as Locke puts it, make it an ill bargain to the offenders. So basically deterrence. So okay, so this is compensation, and this is deterrence. You understand the word deterrence? Prevention. To prevent other people from committing crimes like that. So let's talk about death penalty. Death penalty isn't much of a reparation, right? So okay, like if you injure me, death penalty, and let's say if a criminal injures me, killing the criminal does not repair my body. So this is not reparation. But it is lawful in the state of nature to kill a criminal to make it an ill bargain, to deter, to show an example to other people who are also maybe willing to break the law of nature. And notice again, nothing can be destroyed without a good reason. Destroying the criminal by itself is a bad thing. but destroying a criminal to show an example to all other future potential criminals and thereby saving lives, that's okay. I hope the logic is clear. So it's like destroying an apple to sustain your body, or killing a cow to save a human being. Likewise, you're killing a criminal to prevent other people from committing crimes and thereby saving lives. So you can do this. In fact, it is your duty to do this in the state of nature. Okay, so now immediately. So if the state of nature is so wonderful, why leave it? Let's just continue living in the state of nature. And Locke says, not exactly. So I hope I have this right, but we need to double check this. So Locke writes, I don't know. Yeah. So paragraph 124, 126. That in the state of nature, we do not have, there is no first of all, there is no established, settled, promulgated, known law. No established law. So, what does it mean? It means that everybody intuitively knows more or less what's the right thing to do. This is Locke's assumption. That everybody intuitively more or less understands the law of nature. But we do not have it written down in clear, formulated form. So we have only an intuition, not an established law. Secondly, we have judges in the state of nature. But everybody is a judge in their own case. We do not have impartial judges. And thirdly, sometimes in the state of nature, you will not have enough power to enforce. So again, imagine my example with a bully in the state of nature. Maybe the bully is strong, and I simply do not have enough power to punish the bully. So these are the three things which are lacking in the state of nature. So basically, the criminal is too strong. The criminal is too strong. Which is why, in the state of nature, you do not have horrors like in Hobbes, but you have inconveniences. These are the chief inconveniences of the state of nature. Inconveniences of the state of nature. They're okay. I mean, you can live with them. They're not bad. A worse tyranny is much worse. But still, this is inconvenient. So what people should do, again, look back to this formula. Again, so the worst tyranny is worse than anarchy, but the real political society is better than anarchy. So what people do is they get together and they take this executive power of the law of nature. So we unite, and we delegate the executive power of the law of nature to the state. Delegate the executive power of the law of nature to the state. Now this is important. For Hobbes, the social contract, you give up your rights. You completely give them up without asking anything in return. And you cannot break the contract. You cannot annul the contract for Hobbes unless the sovereign disappears. So as long as the sovereign protects you, you must obey, no matter what. This is for Hobbes. The contract is this completely absolute one-sided, right? For Locke, it's different. You see, it is your duty to God to preserve yourself and everybody else. You cannot give up this duty. This duty is always with you. So what you can do is you can entrust this power of the law of nature to the government, but you cannot give it up. You can only delegate, not give up. You understand the difference? So if I have a car and I give it up to you, it's yours. It's yours and I have no right to it. This is Hobbes. This is Hobbes, right? For Locke, it's different. I do not give up my car to you. I lend it to you. And I can take it back under certain conditions. So, and basically, what are these conditions? Most important condition is this. If the government violates the laws of nature, it is your duty to punish the government. So if the government, for Locke, becomes tyrannical and harms people's life, liberty, health, and possessions, if the government harms people's life, liberty, health, and possessions, it's not your right. It is your duty to suppress the government. It is your duty to act against the government. And strictly speaking, Locke says, you are not the rebel in this case. The government is rebel. The tyrannical government is rebel against God. So you, in your service to God, have to put down this rebellion against God. You are making a revolution, but not a rebellion. This is a revolution against rebels against God. So you're punishing rebels of God. And for the same reason, it is your duty to punish criminals in the state of nature. In the same way, it is your duty, if your government is tyrannical, to punish tyrannical government. So again, remember, we are talking about limited government. We are talking about right to revolution in Locke. Remember, we began with this, that Locke is writing to limit government and also in support of the glorious revolution. Immediately, you see this here. So his Locke's analysis of the revolution of 1688 would be that the king has broken the law of nature, is in rebellion against God, and it is our duty to punish the king and create a new state. And again, so you delegate the executive power of the law of nature, but the power is always there with you. You conditionally lend it, you entrust it. Again, the word that Locke uses is fiduciary. Fiduciary. Доверенное лицо. Maybe I should write this on the board. Somewhere. I don't know. Let's write this here. Well, I don't know. Here. Fiduciary. From the Latin word fide, which means trust. Trustee. Доверенное лицо. Again, I'm not sure we should go into the details, but technically speaking, what happens for Locke is people get together and they decide unanimously to be ruled by the majority. People get together and they unanimously decide to be ruled by the majority. And then the majority chooses the form of the government. It could be monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, some kind of mixed form of government, it doesn't matter, by consent. Whatever the people consent to, this is the form of the government. And as long as the government is lawful and fulfills the law of nature, you have the duty to obey the government. But if the government stops fulfilling the law of nature, you disobey, you rebel. Not rebel, you make revolution. It's the government who's rebel against God. This is very important. It's a right of revolution, not of rebellion. Okay, so basically, let me draw it in this fashion. For Locke, you have this hierarchy. Above everything, you have God. And we know about God through the light of our reason. So we use reason to judge about God, and more specifically, we use it to judge what are the laws of nature. So reason establishes God and tells us what the law of nature is. Then, according to reason, for the sake of fulfilling the law of nature, people unite into society. And this has to be unanimous. You understand the word unanimous? Yes. Единодушно, единогласно. Then, within the society, you have the majority, which chooses the form of the government. And some of you may have mistakenly thought that Locke is a supporter of separation of powers. That's not true. You don't have separation of powers in Locke. You have subordination of powers in Locke. The plenitude of power in its entirety, belongs to the people. People are sovereign. Only God is sovereign for Locke. This is very interesting. When you read the second treatise, Locke never uses the word sovereign unless he's talking about God. Only God is sovereign. Only God is sovereign. So all power actually belongs to God, but in society the majority decides what is God's law, and the majority appoints the legislature. So within the structure of the government, so in general society has fullness of power, but society, how does society make decisions? It's hard for society to make decisions. So the way society makes decisions is through the legislature, and then the legislature appoints what Locke calls the federative and the executive branch. So the federative and the executive branch. So the executive branch, this is standard executive power, исполнительная власть, right? What is federative? Federative refers to international relations. So this is international relations. So basically, anything that has to do with relations with foreign powers. But notice, Locke says, let's imagine you have, at the same time, a rebellion at home and a war abroad. This means that you, as the ruler of the country, will have to decide how to use the soldiers. Should you use the soldiers to put down an internal rebellion, or should you send them abroad to fight a war? So it means, and Locke actually says this, that for the sake of practical reason, usually this power should be united in one person. So this isn't a separation of powers. This is a subordination. Legislature appoints the federative and the executive, and they are united in one person, whom Locke usually calls the prince, but it doesn't. I mean, it can vary. So basically, again, Locke's understanding of the conflict during the English Civil War is this. The English legislature has appointed the king with specific tasks to fulfill the laws of the land. Now the king usurps the authority, becomes a tyrant, and so the legislature simply elects a new king. And if the old king decides to not step down, he's a criminal, and we have to punish him. This is Locke's analysis of the situation. Yeah.
Sorry, could you please re-explain where those God's legitimacy comes from, and like
God's legitimacy.
God, like we are.
Yeah. Well.
How does the reason lead you to believing in God?
Yeah. Design argument. Use the argument for God's existence. The argument from design. You look outside the window and you conclude empirically that there's a God. And because you conclude that there's a God, and that by definition of God, God makes everything, God owns everything, because he's the maker.
How do you conclude that?
Huh?
How do you conclude that?
Well, I mean, if you don't think it's a very strong argument, I'm probably the worst person to defend Locke, because I don't think this is a strong argument.
So is it defendable?
Yeah, well, I mean, you need
How's it
to...
defended by critical theories?
Why are you doing this?
This is yours now.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure I could have done a better job. Anyway. Yeah, so, I mean, this is a very complicated discussion. We can have a whole course on theology. I mean, the short answer to your question is, to this day, some people think that the design argument is a good argument and that this is defensible. Some people disagree. So again, like it's an undecided question. But I suppose what is important at the end of the day is that if you lock two people in a room and you let's say a United Nations meeting, and you force them to agree, they will not. So even though Locke says this, he's not able to convince everybody, and this is a failure of his theory. Because his theory presupposes that every person on planet Earth should be able to agree. So, I mean, empirically speaking, Locke is wrong. I mean, this doesn't sound very nice, and I'm giving a lecture on Locke and I'm bashing Locke, but what can I do? I mean, empirically speaking, by his own standard, he's wrong. The only thing that he can say is that all these people who don't believe in God, they are irrational. How convincing is that? I'm not sure. Because I don't know. Like, let's say Christianity. Well, I mean, I think that Christianity, Judaism, Islam combined is probably less than half of world population. So, like, you have to say that half of the world population are irrational. I'm not sure if that's a strong argument.
Yeah, I'm not a proponent of logic just to conceptualize like divine theory. It's like the divine watchmaker. Like you have something that's so complex that doesn't occur in nature naturally that there has to be a creator.
Yes.
Like that's something.
Yeah. This is exactly right. The world is too orderly to be explicable through simply random chance. Therefore, you have to postulate a designer. Again, this argument has all sorts of problems with it. I mean, Hobbes is not convinced. Hume, for example, would say, yeah, the world is orderly, but it's not perfectly orderly. So maybe your designer is an imperfect designer. So it's all sorts of problems with this
Then
argument.
you get into the idea of what God is.
Yeah. No, I mean, I wish we had more time to talk about, and maybe we will in the future lecture on Locke, but I want to get out the most important. Okay. Let's keep thinking about this. As those of you who will choose Locke will have to wrestle with this issue and will have to think about this very carefully. Anyway, let's go back here. People. Most important problem, and probably the most problematic part of Locke's philosophy. What happens if people disagree? What happens if the minority disagrees with the majority? Or what happens if the prince disagrees with the legislature? By the way, Locke also talks about this. He talks about the prerogative power. Prerogative power. Locke says sometimes the prince will have to act outside the law or against the law. So outside the letter of the law or against the letter of the law to preserve the spirit of the law. You understand it, right? And his own example is this. There's a fire in a city and you need to tear down an innocent person's building to prevent the fire from spreading. And let's suppose there's no law to do that. Let's suppose it's against the law. Because it doesn't matter, the prince tears down the building. Why? Because as Cicero tells us, salus populi suprema lex, right? The health of the people is supreme law. So if you're doing this for the common good, yeah, feel free to violate the law. Now, of course, what Locke imagines is that after the prince does this, he goes back to the people, he explains the reasons for his actions, they debate, discuss, and they say, oh yeah, you were right, okay, excellent. Or they say, no, you were wrong, we will judge you. But under extreme circumstances, if the prince thinks that the legislature is corrupt, and the prince decides to not step down, George Klosko gives this argument. He says, when Richard Nixon was during the Watergate scandal, let's suppose that Richard Nixon would have said, all of this is communist propaganda, and I order the troops to enter Washington and dissolve the Senate. What would happen, constitutionally speaking? Like if Nixon declared a state of emergency, what would happen? How do you resolve this conflict? Well, again, here's the most problematic point of Locke's philosophy. The problematic point, and Thomas Hobbes, bursts out laughing when he hears this. What Locke says is that if the minority disagrees with the majority, or if the prince disagrees with the legislature, what you do is you, as Locke says, you appeal to heaven. Appeal to heaven. Now, let's be very careful. Maybe let me do this, okay? When he says appeal to heaven, he doesn't mean pray to God. What he means is dig up your Kalashnikov and resort to violence. So this is not appeal to heaven, but appeal to violence. Violence. Force. Now, why does he use this strange example? Well, this is the way Locke talks about this. I mean, in the text, he says, well, if there will be no judge on earth, the only judge is in heaven and he's God. And we have to appeal to heaven the same way Jephthah appealed to heaven against the Ammonites. I don't know. Any of you know the Bible by heart? There's this famous, fairly famous judge of the Israelites. So one of the leaders of the tribes of Israel, whose name is Jephthah. In Russian, Yefai. Is this important? I don't know. Maybe, probably not. And what he does is he appeals to heaven against the Ammonites. He goes to war. So basically, appeal to heaven is you go to war, and the one who wins, God is on his side. This is why Locke uses this phrase. But when he uses this phrase, he means go to war. Now, do you see the problem with this? Do you see the problem with this? Locke says, every person on planet Earth knows the law of nature, we all can agree and decide, blah, blah, blah. But if we cannot agree, we go to war. What does Hobbes say? Hobbes says, yes, exactly. Hobbes says, at this point, Hobbes writes, QED. Thank you very much. You've done my work for me. This is what your political philosophy will lead to. Your political philosophy will lead to war of all against all, as I, Thomas Hobbes, have told you. And as a matter of fact, within Locke's philosophy, there are no breaks to this. There's no breaks. There's no safety mechanism. There's no safety valve. Because at any given point in time, if you believe that the law of nature is being broken, it is your duty, remember, to punish the violators. Now, of course, like if you're living in Nazi Germany, and you wake up in the morning, right? And let's suppose not your life is threatened, but somebody else's life is threatened. So let's say you are a Wehrmacht officer in Nazi Germany, and you are protected by the sovereign, well, by the state, sorry. But you know that Jews are being, and communists and gays, communists are being sent to the concentration camps. So when you wake up in the morning, since the moment you wake up in the morning, you should ask yourself, do I have enough to eat? And if you have enough to eat, the rest of your day you should spend as much as possible trying to help those people. Now, do you rush out into the street and get killed by Gestapo? No, because this is stupid, this is against the law of nature. But you should try as much as possible, as effectively as possible, to protect those people. So maybe you print underground newspapers, maybe you talk to your neighbors, whatever. But all of your time has to be sincerely occupied trying to protect those people. Something like that. Yeah. So why is this a problematic point? Well, the question is, how realistic is that? And unless this is real, unless this is realistic, all this philosophy kind of, what's the right phrase? Become, well, I don't know, hangs in the air. Let's put it that way. And but ultimately, so I mean, when we talk about this appeal to heaven, well, we'll talk about this more, because in principle, Locke can say, well, you should only rebel if you think that you will be successful in your rebellion. But then, will this ever work in practice? And what will be the difference between government and tyranny? Anyway, I'm not sure if this was clear. Don't worry about this too much. But this is the general schema. So we should talk about property. But before we talk about property, let me very briefly, I hope I can do this in 5 minutes. Let me very briefly summarize the difference between Hobbes and Locke. So here we have Hobbes, here we have Locke. So again, so for Hobbes, you have the horrors of the state of nature. For Locke, you only have the inconveniences of the state of nature. And the horrors for Hobbes come down to the fact that the worst tyranny is never worse than anarchy. But for Locke, you have this, that political society is better than anarchy, but anarchy is better than the worst tyranny. And in Hobbes, there's no morality. Whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, is that what you call it, right? For Locke, there is morality. There's God, we know him by the light of our reason, and he gives us the law of nature. So in Hobbes, you have the right to all things. Basically, everybody has a right to everything, or nobody has a right to nothing. Whereas for Locke, you have the law of nature. And this law of nature is your duty to preserve yourself and others. Duty to preserve yourself and others. So duty to protect yourself and to protect other people. Maybe I should write to protect. Which is to say, to be the executive of the law of nature. It's exactly the same thing, right? Now, in Hobbes, you give up your rights. You give up this right. This right to all things is given up to the sovereign. You relinquish it. In exchange for protection. The sovereign does not have to protect you, but if the sovereign stops protecting you, he stops being the sovereign and the contract becomes void. So the sovereign must protect you, even though he doesn't have to. Otherwise, the contract becomes void. For Locke, not so. You take this duty to protect and you delegate it. You don't give it up, you delegate it to the government. And finally, so here, for Hobbes, government is sovereign. Let me erase this. Government is sovereign. In a sense, government is supreme and can do whatever. Absolutely whatever. It's not limited by anything. Again, I remind you, the sovereign for Hobbes exists in the state of nature and therefore has the right to all things. But for Locke, government is limited. Government is limited. And specifically, it is limited by the law of nature. If the government violates the law of nature, it will be punished by the people. It has to be punished by the people. And so, basically, for Hobbes, your obedience is automatic. Your consent is automatic. you are automatically presumed to consent. You must consent to the government if it protects you. Mutual relation between protection and obedience. If you are protected, you automatically must obey. You have an automatic obligation to obey. Why? Because it's in the reason of your self-preservation. But for Locke, not so. You have to give your consent, and we'll talk about this later, but of course most people don't give consent. So Locke has a theory of explicit, and tacit consent. Tacit consent, but both explicit and tacit consent can be withdrawn, and here you have revolution, the right to revolution.
You cannot call it express.
Yeah, yes, they call it express. Okay, well, I don't know. Explicit or express consent. Let's write express.
Because it sounds a bit
Yeah.
more complicated what they have to
Yeah.
do.
So you understand this express? Well, we'll talk about this later in more detail. But the idea is that express consent is when you express your consent. You say, "I hereby officially consent to the government." This is express consent. Tacit consent is different. Tacit consent is when you do something and you implicitly are supposed to have consented. How do we translate implicit into Russian? Yeah, молчаливое согласие, right? So like if you use the roads, if you use the healthcare system, etc., Locke says we assume that you have consented, even though you haven't said anything. But it's important that your tacit consent, even though you have been presumed to be, silently agreeing, you can withdraw your tacit consent and make revolution if you have to. So I suppose maybe in some very oversimplified fashion, the way to summarize the difference between Hobbes and Locke is to say that for Hobbes, people are bad by nature, and for Locke, people are good by nature.
Then why do they need a government? If they're good.
Yes. They're good, but they're not perfectly good. They're good, but they're not angels. They need the government because in the state of nature, we do not have established law, impartial judges, and power to enforce, and this gives rise to inconveniences. So life in the state of nature is mostly good, but it's problematic. For these three reasons. Because again, people will mostly obey the law of nature, but not perfectly. Again, sometimes criminals will escape punishment, sometimes people will disagree on the intuitive interpretation of the law, that kind of thing. But that's a very good question. This is a very good question. This is exactly the kind of question that people should ask. If people for Locke are good, why do you need the government at all? This is three reasons.
Can we say that Locke's argument about religion is similar to Hobbes' argument about the sovereign? Because we have to give up our rights to God, and we don't have any.
No, I would disagree. Because, again, Hobbes basically says people are mistrustful, essentially. People are untrustworthy, and also our appetites change constantly, and some people seek glory. This means that there can never be peace on earth. We cannot agree. There can be no consensus for Hobbes. For Hobbes, there can be no consensus, so we have to agree to disagree. We have to agree to disagree. Why? Because this at least gives us the opportunity to not die. This at least preserves our life. So we have to agree to disagree, and the only thing we can agree on is that all of our appetites are different. And Hobbes says, my appetites this morning are different from my appetites this evening, but I have this basic unchanging appetite, which is to not die. And this is the basis. And I give up my right to the sovereign selfishly, because this allows me to gratify this one desire, to not die. So Hobbes is an immoralist. I do this, again, I obey the government for purely selfish reasons. Yes, I selfishly calculate that I would prefer to not die rather than die. For Locke, very differently. For Locke, you see, again, Hobbes lives in this materialistic universe. Everything is chaotic matter in motion. Nothing makes sense. L'être et le néant, right? In Sartre. Nothing makes sense. Or in Nietzsche, or in somebody else, right? The universe is meaningless. For Locke, not so. There's an order of value in the universe. God creates the world, and therefore everything that exists has a value, because it's God's property and God's workmanship, God's product. Okay. Okay, there's one last, but these are good questions. One last thing that we need to talk about is property in Locke. So this is a whole separate issue, and sometimes there's a whole separate question on the University of London just about property. So this is important. So basically, you have property before the state. Remember, no one ought to harm another in his life, liberty, health, or possessions. But how is it possible to have possessions before the state? You see, again, for Hobbes, nothing belongs to anybody in the state of nature. You can take certain things and hold on to them as long as you have the power to do so, as long as you have enough force to keep something in your grasp. But in general, you have no right of possession for Hobbes. Not so for Locke. For Locke, you have the right to own things before we enter into society. In fact, this is going to be very important because the states have to begin by pulling their land together. People pull their land together, the land that they own. Okay, so this is important. Let me write this out. So first of all, everything belongs to God. So we're talking about property. So everything is God's property. Then what God does is he delegates property to people. He says, God gives earth to man in common. So, is this communism? Well, to some extent, yes. You have to see, basically, this argument can be, unfolded into a communist type scheme. There are communists, there are Lockean communists. Anyway, so God gives earth to man in common. And again, if I have a surplus, if I have more than I need, and you are starving, it is my duty to share. Because of this. Because the property belongs to everybody in common. So it means that for you to take something in private possession, you have to have consent of everybody. So you have to have universal consent. So if every person on planet Earth agrees to give me something, I can have it as my private property. Well, when I said every person on planet Earth, including people who are dead and people who are not yet born. That's a problem, because you cannot really ask them. So it means that basically, because you cannot ask directly, you have to be able to presume tacit consent. So you presume the tacit consent of everybody, including people who are not yet born. So basically, what we're talking about a situation where there can be no reasonable objection or no rational objection. Let's have a simple example. Well, actually, Locke gives a bunch of examples. He says, let's suppose I am thirsty and there's a river, and I take a sip of water from the river. Can I do so? Locke says, yes. Why? Because I am fulfilling God's law. God commands me to preserve myself. So in order to preserve myself, I have to take this sip of water. So no person on planet Earth can have a rational objection to that, including people who are not yet born. So this sip of water I'm taking inside my mouth, it is mine by right. So this is where it's complicated, and we'll untangle this, but Locke deploys, the commentators talk about Locke's schema as uniting or combining two different arguments. The labor mixing argument, and the labor theory of value. Labor theory of value. Basically, what Locke is saying is that if there is enough and as good left for everybody else, let me write these words on the board. Enough and as good. Enough and as good. If there's enough and as good left for everybody else, if I mix my labor with something, I am entitled to it. Like if we're walking through a forest and there are apples, and I take this apple and I put it in my pocket, it's mine as long as there's enough and as good apples left on the tree. Like if you are walking beside me, and you are indifferent between taking an apple from my pocket, or picking it from a tree, you should pick from a tree, because this apple is mine. It's not absolutely mine, because everything belongs to God, and God gives everybody in common, but here, you should not have a reasonable objection to me putting this apple in my pocket. Now, in addition to this, Locke has not particularly complicated, but difficult to grasp on the first try. He has an interesting argument about how, especially this labor theory of value, it says because labor increases the value of what he says are almost worthless natural resources, nobody should object to me enclosing a piece of land. Okay, this may sound, it's not complicated, but it may sound complicated. Maybe you won't understand this time, but let me just say it out loud. So basically, Locke is saying, imagine that we're living in a forest, and I need this whole room to feed myself. This whole room is by right mine, because I need it to feed myself. I'm doing my duty to God. But let's suppose I'm taking this piece of land and I'm enclosing it. I'm putting a fence. And now I start working on this piece of land. And now this piece of land is enough for me to feed myself. Only this small piece of land. The rest is now yours. So even though I have taken something from the common stock, in fact, I have increased the common stock. This is counterintuitive. Basically what it says is that like, if people don't enclose land and live as hunter-gatherers, they need more land. If they enclose land and work as agriculturalists, they need less land. So transition to agriculture increases, in some sense, increases the common stock of humanity. So when you enclose a piece of land and start working on it, it's as if you're not taking anything from anybody else. That's why there can be no reasonable objection. But at the end of the day, what is important for Locke is that today, when he lives in England, right, there is no extra land. So there is no land which is good, which is as good, right, and enough left for others. So basically, his justification of present-day inequality is exactly say hi to John Rawls, if you've heard this name before. Basically, Locke says, you have the prince, he's very rich. You have, Locke's own example is a day laborer, разнорабочий. He's poor. But the Indian of the America is even poorer. So this is the prince. This is the day laborer in England. And this is the king in the Americas. King of the Americas. And he says, because the laborer has more, so this is like economic productivity, trickle down, something like that. So inequality, so this inequality which stimulates the prince, this doesn't sound very reasonable, whatever. The inequality which stimulates the prince to work more, that's why there's more stuff, everything is cheaper. Again, say hi to Adam Smith or something like that, right? So the laborer has more than a king in the Americas. So basically, with inequality, and in civil society, you have more than in this condition of common property in the state of nature. And because the least advantaged member of the population is better off than the Indian of the Americas, you can presume the tacit consent of the laborer. So yeah, so basically Locke is saying, yes, the laborer in England is poorer than the prince, but you can still presume his tacit consent because he's better off than if we lived in a state of nature and all the property would have been in common. Is this more or less clear? But of course, if you do an empirical calculation and you find that the Indians of the Americas are actually better off than the day laborers in England, then John Locke unrolls a red flag and begins to sing the Communist International. And I kind of feel that on this happy note, maybe that's it. Questions? Problems?
How could you apply this problem to slavery?
Slavery is completely illegal for Locke. Well, again, Locke would say that the only exception is this. Let's suppose I am a criminal in the state of nature. Locke actually has a wonderful phrase. He says, I am a degenerate and noxious creature. I do not know the law of nature, and I have set myself apart from the common rule of reason. I commit crimes. I hack people to pieces with an axe. What I have done, I have forfeited my life. My life does not belong to me anymore, because by right I should be killed. So now, because by right I should be killed, I could instead be taken as a slave as mercy to me. So basically, people on death sentence are the only people who can be slaves. So, but in general, let's say the slave trade that went on in Europe and the Americas at the time, no. This is completely and utterly illegal for Locke. And in fact, again, you see, I suppose this is the big problem when you compare Hobbes and Locke. Because if you look at this picture and you ask, what about the slaves in Egypt? Why did they obey the Pharaoh? Or let's say, take the slaves of the Americas, right? Of the 13 colonies, or let's say of American South. Why did they obey? And Locke would have to say they have lost their reason. They have lost their reason. They were irrational. They forgot that they actually had a duty to rebel. So you see, there's a big problem in Locke. There's a deep element of unrealism in Locke. Because Locke would have to say that most people alive, who lived in historical times on planet Earth, they just lost their reason. They forgot what they were doing. What they were doing. I mean, Hobbes has a valid answer. Hobbes says, yeah, people obeyed, the slaves obeyed because they were afraid to die. What can you do? It was actually rational for them to do so. But Locke, with this whole picture again, his own phrase for slaves in Egypt, he says this is called direct slavery under the force of war. So the slavery in the American South, or slavery in Egypt, or slavery in this wonderful country, which existed up until 1871 or something? 1861, okay, yeah. 1861, yeah, this is direct slavery under the force of war, a direct slavery under the force of war, and people were just irrational and forgot. And notice, for Locke, it's very important, because the violation is against God, you cannot really forgive this violation. So if it turns out that my great-great-great-grandparents were slaves, and somebody is alive today who benefited from their slavery, it is my duty to punish them, well, not for restraint, but at least for reparation. I'm entitled to take away their property. So this whole discussion right now in the American election about reparations for slavery, Locke would be completely in support of that. Well, actually, Locke would say it's our duty. We have to do this. We have to spend time and money and effort to try to make a restitution. It's our duty to God.
What if the 15 slaves would permit 500 people to live?
Okay. Yeah, this is a very good question for Locke. You see, Locke assumes that God gives earth to men plentifully. That there's enough resources for everybody. In fact, Locke has this wonderful phrase, writing in the 17th century. He has, the earth has enough resources, double the population. In the 17th century, he talks about this. So basically, he never imagines a situation where you have to enslave some people to enable others to live. He never imagined this situation. And again, notice, like the fact that 500 people are better off because of the slaves, this doesn't do anything. Because your duties are before rights. Your duty is not to be happy and prosperous. Your duty is to preserve God's property. So if some people are slaves, you should rectify this first. And if it means that you will have less food to eat, well, sorry. It's your duty to God first to help others, and then, as long as you have enough to survive. Well, again, Locke's own phrase is this: when your own preservation comes not in competition, or comes not in conflict, something like that. Yeah. Okay, people. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I hope this was more or less clear. Next time, we'll talk about Rousseau and John Stuart Mill. If you have any questions, by all means, stay behind. I'd be glad to answer, for as long as you need. Otherwise, again, thank you so very much for your attention, and I will see you on the seminar on Friday.